The need to connect is universal. To communicate and share our collective knowledge. To entertain, move business forward. To serve and protect. And to reach further. At Intelsat, we imagine a world of continuous growth and innovation, powered by ubiquitous connectivity, no matter where we live, work, or play. We are the foundational architects of satellite communication, and our purpose remains the same today as when we began: to connect people, communities, businesses, and governments, to deliver solutions and services that empower our customers' and partners' success, and to maximize human potential. Together, we've brought the world a series of firsts and shaped the communication landscape we know today. By combining our terrestrial and satellite platforms with end-to-end professional services, our seamless network enables high-performing connections in more places than ever before. We power businesses with solutions that help streamline operations, enable seamless collaboration, and reliably connect locations across the globe as if they were only across the hall. We provide media distributors access to some of the most sought-after video neighborhoods, bringing audiences to their feet with the high-quality video content they crave. We make two-way video, voice, and data transfer possible in hard-to-reach places, whether on land, in the air, or out at sea. And we support organizations around the world with an easy-to-deploy, no-fail network for mission-critical communications when moments matter. We strive for excellence in every interaction with our customers and their users. Our team of dedicated experts works closely with our partners and customers to overcome the challenges of today and push the boundaries of connectivity tomorrow. Because in the space between friends and family, businesses and their customers, organizations and those they serve, is a world of greater possibility. That innovation begins with connection, and connection begins with us. Intelsat. Imagine here.
Welcome back to the APSCC 2021 webinar series. I'm Christopher Slaughter, your MC for the series. Today, our subject is the Global Operators Roundtable, and the subject is M&A, partnerships, and the changing competitive landscape. Now, this is a follow-on from the Regional Operators Roundtable, which we had just last week. And our host for today's session, again, the moderator, Jose Del Rosario from NSR. Joining us today as panelists, Terry Bleakley from Intelsat, Harsh Verma from SES, and Peter Gervin from Viasat. Today's session is brought to you by the generous support of Intelsat, so we're very happy to have their continued support and participation in the APSCC webinar series. With that, take it away, Jose.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Jose Del Rosario of NSR. I will be your moderator for today's webinar, Global Satellite Operators Roundtable, M&As, Partnerships, and the Changing Competitive Landscape. We're joined by a distinguished group of panelists. We have Terry Bleakley, Regional Vice President for Asia at Intelsat, Peter Gervin, Vice President for Asia Pacific at Viasat, and Harsh Verma, Vice President for Fixed Data Asia at SES. Welcome, gentlemen. The top global operators have announced strategic partnerships, key investments, going public in the case of Telesat, and other initiatives that have and will continue to change the competitive landscape over the mid to long term. This panel today will examine satellite business issues in the Asia Pacific, including the impact of mergers and acquisition activity, threat and/or opportunities presented by LEOs, and the strategic roadmap ahead for these large global players. First off, and by way of your opening statements, gentlemen, what is the investment roadmap in terms of risk-taking for your companies specific to the Asia Pacific region? Let's start with Terry Bleakley of Intelsat, please. Terry.
Thanks, Jose, and thanks to APSCC for organising this panel. Great to be part of it, and it's December already. Doesn't time fly? Intelsat's been in Asia Pacific since the 1960s and has been investing in the region since then. With respect to our roadmap and what we're doing in the future, we're in the process of investing $2 billion in what we call our unified network. That unified network is multi-orbit, multi-spectrum, virtualized, open standard 5G. Now, there's a lot of words, and hopefully during this panel, I'll expand on what that really means. But how that is reflected in Asia is we'll be launching 2 software-defined payloads in Asia. We'll be putting infrastructure on the ground in multiple countries in Asia to support that network, which will be virtualized over time. And that's really exciting for us. So Asia is very much on the footprint of the build out of this unified network. If we look at what we're doing with investment in human capital in the region, we made an acquisition of GoGo Commercial Aviation about a year ago. GoGo Commercial Aviation is now our commercial aviation division integrated into Intelsat. And that's helped us sort of grow our presence in Asia. To give an example, we previously had around 4 people in our Indian office. That's now over 40 people. Most of those are in Chennai. Most of those work in our commercial aviation division and develop software solutions for the aero industry. But we're looking at seeing how we can take that development and use it in maritime and other verticals we represent. On top of that, we've invested in a network operations center in India. We've got a follow the sun network operations center methodology now, where we've moved just from Atlanta, and we have other centers throughout the world. India is where we chose to put our Asia center. If we look at sort of risk taking and minimizing risk, we continue to develop partnerships with operators in places like Asia Pacific. JSAT's a good example of that, where we've launched a number of satellites, 4 satellites in the past. We continue along that journey with JSAT to see how we take that forward and look at other opportunities around that theme to further develop our infrastructure and network in the Asia Pacific region. And if I just sort of drill down a little more, so we know we're talking about big spacecraft and unified networks. We are investing in hub infrastructure on the ground as well. Presently, not just for the unified network. We announced last week our Flex Maritime node is going live in India. We've cleared all the regulatory approvals, which is a time-consuming process, and we'll be launching that early next year. Why that's really important, first of all, there's a lot of money and a lot of time put into getting that node in place, but if you look at sort of the statistics in India, 95% of volume and 70% of value of all trade is done via maritime waters, which is really interesting statistic. So this will give us access to Indian flagged vessels and also international vessels as they come through Indian waters. And sort of the last thing on sort of risk taking is we've looked strategically at countries in Asia Pacific to where we can seed equipment, put in hub infrastructure, pay for it, and then let our partners come in and use sort of a pay per use play where they don't have to commit to any long-term capacity, but they use what we've created to promote satellite in the industry. And we've found that's been quite a successful strategy. So we'll look to continue smaller investments strategically to promote satellite in specific countries in the Asia Pacific region.
Excellent. Sounds like you're going to be very busy for a long time, Terry. You mentioned $2 billion. That's a lot. And GoGo was an acquisition that caught a lot of people's attention. Is this the first of many, perhaps, or?
Sorry, I missed the question.
Okay, GoGo was an acquisition that caught a lot of people's attention. Is this one of many, or you're going to look at
I suppose mergers and acquisitions are always being looked at. I can't sort of talk to that in any more detail than that, but GoGo did take people by surprise. It was a $400 million acquisition. That isn't part of our $2 billion build out. But I think, you know, all of us are looking at opportunities. We'll hear Peter talk about what's happened to his organization soon. So I think it's an opportune time. We're going to be in a strong position financially in 2022 to make certain plays, and we'll definitely be looking at the market.
Excellent. Thank you, Terry. Peter, risk-taking and strategic profile for Viasat in Asia Pacific. Of course, the big news that everybody's talking about is the investment or merger acquisition with Inmarsat. Can you speak a little bit about that and how that affects Asia, please?
Yeah, thanks, Jose. And like Terry, thanks for APSCC for having us at this roundtable. There's only so much we can say about Inmarsat right now with the acquisition due to the fact that it's not closed and we're going through regulatory. So there's only a little bit that we can talk about. But, you know, primarily our investment in Asia is continuing as we've announced for a number of years with the Viasat-3 Asia Pacific satellite. You know, it's a terabit of capacity over the Asia Pac region, and our plans, and we're well underway right now, is to build the ground infrastructure for that satellite predominantly in Australia due to a number of reasons. So that investment's continuing, and that's part of, like Terry said, you know, we've got a global strategy around our Viasat-3 constellation, the 3 satellites over the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pac, and we too have invested about $2 billion in that program. So it's been really sort of good that we've seen the you know, the Asia satellite move into our factory in Arizona, you know, from a payload point of view in recent times. So it's really becoming real, and we've started to build the ground infrastructure in Australia. That being said, you know, we've said in our press releases with respect to the Inmarsat acquisition around, you know, what does it do for us, and essentially, you know, it's a merger of complementary businesses. So we are still very much, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit later when we get to the LEO part of the session, but we've always been on the same page, I think, as most of the big satellite operators, in that it's a hybrid approach, right? You need to have capacity with GEO. You can have some low latency with LEO, but it's a combination of these LEO, MEO, GEO constellations that are going to drive the businesses moving forward. And we see the merger with Inmarsat. Sorry, Terry, Freudian slip. No, but we see the Inmarsat deal. Particularly, they are complementary businesses. You know, we have LEO filings under Viasat. Inmarsat has the same. They've got a GEO fleet like we have. Complementary businesses, complementary strategies. You know, and it's essentially a merger of people and technology and process. So we see those things as highly complementary. But I want to emphasise the hybrid approach, right? We don't think it's a one or the other style business moving forward. We don't think it's GEO or LEO. And I know that that's there is a sort of a religious zealotry around the GEO and LEO when you go to conferences and you talk to people about it, but we're still very much on the page of hybrid. You know, LEO brings certain things to the party, particularly low latency. However, it's yet to be proved that the LEO constellations can bring the very, very high throughput or the very, very high capacity that the big GEOs can bring to the market. So, you know, we're still very much pursuing our strategy, which is driving down the cost per bit by putting up, you know, higher capacity satellites for the same size and roughly the same cost, so you can drive the cost per bit down. And I think everyone's sort of waiting to see what the true cost per bit of these LEO constellations will be moving forward once they hit commercial service. So I guess that when I talk about risk, I think when we think about risk out here in Asia Pacific, I think the biggest risk is not necessarily, you know, is us making big investments when the regulatory environment across Asia Pac is, like Terry said, it's very disjointed. You have to make big investments in some of these countries to even get landing rights, to get spectrum. There was a big, you know, spectrum discussion leading up to WRC 19. I know that's 2 years ago, but that is still not over. in Asia, there is still, specifically I'm talking around the KA band, there's still consultations going on in many countries in Southeast Asia. There are still countries who are going to allocate or who are signaled that they're going to allocate KA band to 5G. So when you talk about risk, I mean, the risk we think of is putting up all this capacity with this large investment over Asia without, whilst there's still uncertainty from a regulatory point of view around landing rights, spectrum rights, costs, some countries want to auction against 5G, for example, as well, the KA band. So we look at that, that's what we see as risk, not necessarily competitive risk against the people on this forum and our other traditional satellite. It's more what we see as the risk is this regulatory and competitive risk that still exists with the 5G marketplace.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. So we talk a lot about technology, we talk a lot about competitiveness, but the field has to be level for all actors to really engage. Excellent. Okay, Harsh, what's the viewpoint from SES? We talked about multi-orbit, so you're certainly there with O3B. What's up ahead for SES? Are you going to do M&As? What's your strategic roadmap ahead, please?
Okay, thank you, Jose, for having me here, and thanks, APSCC. Glad to be part of this panel. I much agree with Terry and Peter, both. Peter specifically on that point of uncertainty in the market, because this APAC market is fragmented, huge number of operators, they're nationalized operators as well, which causes an unlevel playing field. Things are opening up, it's not there yet, but there's this risk or uncertainty, but there's a huge opportunity on the flip side. I mean, we can't ignore the fact that Asia is home to 50 to 60% of the world's population. And mobile backhauling will be the growth engine. It is the growth engine and will be the growth engine, especially for the GEO-HTS and the NGSO constellations. A vast majority of this population is underserved. If I speak about SES, look, I mean, our O3B MEO constellation that we launched in 2014, the earliest adopters of O3B technology were in Asia Pacific. People like Digicel, Telenor Group, Timor Telecom. I mean, these people have still stayed with us for almost 7 to 8 years, and we are now drawing up plans for a next generation medium Earth orbit called O3B mPOWER. Then in terms of our other investments, obviously we have more than 10 satellites, geosatellites operating and providing services in Asia. The most prominent one, the recent one, was SES-12, the high throughput satellite covering whole of Asia Pacific. We have invested a sizable amount of money in the ground infrastructure. I mean, O3B today has 3 gateways operational in Asia. And then you talk about SES-12, we have gateways in Adelaide, we built the diversity gateway in Jakarta, we built one in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and we're looking at other regions, other countries as well. So this will continue to grow. We are not shying away from making investments into this important market. mPOWER is our, I would say, SES growth engine into the future. This is a $2 billion program, and it will be, the first launch is happening in the next 1 or 2 months. And we will be building, again, the ground infrastructure will start build out in Australia to begin with, but then we'll get expanding into each of these countries, because mPOWER has that flexible payload with that option of building in-country gateways. So specifically, if I talk about, I mean, in Asia, so we see partnerships as the key to our growth, and that's where we have invested most of our time and effort. If I talk about Pivotal in Australia, which was hosting our O3B MEO gateway, we've expanded the relationship. So now they will be hosting and building the mPOWER gateways as we speak. TeleGlobal in Indonesia has been a stellar partnership for us. We started that relationship with Bhakti, the lease capacity phase 1 project in 2019. and there has been no looking back. We built the SES-12 HTS gateways and invested in that. We've continued to expand that relationship with Bhakti as well into the phase 2 as we deploy. We've deployed another platform as well for the Papua region. And similarly in Malaysia with BinaSat, who's again a premier service provider, with MCMC bringing all these digital inclusion projects, we continue to see that growth. And similarly, we've invested in the HTS gateways there and also on a wide beam. So it's continuing to grow. And on that part, I mean, also beyond just expanding the service providers, I think the other partnerships that we are bringing to the market will be, I would say, cloud, because all the workloads will start to move to cloud. It's already moving. We've seen that in the pandemic phase, how cloud has become more and more important. It's closer to bring the cloud experience to the users. Satellite is no different. So our relationships with Microsoft Azure and Amazon Web Services, we're bringing that cloud infrastructure closer. All our gateways will host these servers or will be connected to the cloud with a single hop, lowest latency service. In terms of our technology vendor partnerships, Gillard, ST Engineering are our key partners as we grow into the Empower phase, and also the antenna vendors, including Intellian and Isotropic. And we have a unique program in SES, the partner program, where we reward partners who bring business to us, and we have very flexible contracts with them. And I think this is very important, as Terry touched base upon mobility or maritime. I think that's very important, and we've seen huge growth in the partner program in the maritime segment.
Excellent. Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Harsh. So lots going on, lots of issues, lots of opportunities. Let's start with technology. We're a very technology-centric industry. Going forward, as you tap into opportunities in 5G, cloud, virtualization, et cetera, space assets have to evolve as well. So starting with Terry, are you going to go all in on software-defined satellites, for instance, in order to tap into these opportunities?
Yeah, look, I think development of this unified network, I'll go into a little bit of depth on that because it will help answer the question you're asking. I think let's just pull 5G out of the equation first, and it will show you the direction Intelsat is heading. We're a big believer of open standards and working in the 5G, 3GPP environment. Harsh has said that, a big growth area is cellular backhaul and build out of mobile phone networks. And we are sort of the same opinion. If you look at how satellite has touched mobile networks in the 2G, 3G, 4G world, we were able to connect, but we weren't part of their standard, and we had to do everything to make satellite connect. It wasn't easy in the earlier versions. It got easier in the later versions, but we still were like a pimple on the side of the network. We didn't seamlessly integrate. And what we've done, and others have joined us, is we've got in the 7 groups, there's 7 international groups that make up the 3GPP, and we were welcomed when we joined, and we've been helping them develop standards around how to integrate satellite into the 5G network. That's been culminated with release 17, which should come out in the next few months, of 3GPP, which will have a non-terrestrial version which completely envelopes how satellite is integrated into the 5G universe working forward. And that's a major, major step. And, it has many, many implications in that we can use equipment that it isn't necessarily proprietary. It opens us up to scale. It simplifies integration into networks. We recently did a study with OneWeb on using satellite and their flat panel antenna for connecting to a 5G network, and it works seamlessly. The Fraunhofer group, which does a lot of studies, took a lot of data from that, which is being used to give to the 3GPP audience. So, a big part of our whole network design is around open standards and moving forward to that 3GPP 5G world. So saying that, I spoke at the start about a $2 billion investment in a multi-orbit strategy. And part of that is software-defined payloads. We've ordered 2 already. We'll be ordering another 2 soon. Steve Spengler spoke of those on a recent address he did to the AVIA satellite forum. So that's 4, and we have more on the agenda. Will they all be software defined? I think sometimes we see areas where broadcast satellite makes sense in traditional KU band, so I think there'll be a mix. On the ground, virtualizing the network becomes critical. So the infrastructure that looks to those software defined payloads is a critical part of that piece, and we're doing a lot of work with players we can't name publicly on how we integrate that into our network and virtualize the network. Why that becomes important is we're going to be able to use compute devices off the shelf to build our network going forward, which again reduces the cost significantly. You can see companies like Rakuten in Japan who are building out their mobile network on a virtualized platform. I suppose we're looking at something very similar when it moves to satellite. When we look at our multi-orbit play, which sits on top of our software-defined payload, we're very much in line with what Peter and what Harsh is saying, that it's a hybrid approach, and we believe in not one band, and we believe in not one altitude for servicing customers. We filed recently with the FCC and the ITU spectrum for a MEO constellation. When we look at LEO and MEO, we think MEO is a really nice balance of investment and coverage. It's not crowded, and it sort of provides what we believe is that balance that our customers are looking for, and it's the sort of the path that SES has been following. We see a lot of synergy in that. So it's software-defined network. It's a unified network. It's open standards. It's multi-orbit. It's multi-spectrum. And that's where we need to head, we believe, to satisfy the requirements of what our customers will want moving forward.
Great. Thank you, Terry. Peter, your thoughts on software-defined satellites and open standards as put forth by Terry.
Yeah, so I think we're probably not on the same page as open standards necessarily, but that's because we're sort of vertically integrated and we manufacture our own ground infrastructure and satellite payloads. So, we talk a lot about software-defined satellites, but I think from our perspective, the question is, what's the outcome you want, right? And the outcome that you want is not in broadcast, because I do take Terry's point around broadcast, but when you're talking about comm satellites, you want flexibility of coverage and capacity and your ability to allocate, your ability to move stuff around versus the old bent pipe satellites where you had to try and predict capacity and usage, 18 years in advance, 3 years to manufacture and 15 years to use. So I think what everybody's looking for in the comms satellites is, the ability to flex beam sizes, the ability to move capacity in and out of beams. And so then it's a question of how do you do that, right? And one way of doing that is you do it on the spacecraft itself. Another way of doing that is if you're vertically integrated with the ground, you make other decisions to move functionality between the spacecraft and the ground. So in the Viasat-3 constellation, our ground infrastructure is very different. We've got hundreds of small gateways for each satellite connecting to some quite large data centers, which moves into this cloud. I love everyone using the term cloud, but I'm an old telco engineer, and cloud for me is a massive warehouse with hundreds of racks of equipment. I think of a data center when we think of cloud. So you look at the way that satellite is moving, like Terry said, but I'm an old telco guy. We're moving exactly the same way as the rest of telco. And that is we are reducing the amount of RF equipment at the gateways. We're moving to IP-centric comms within our networks. And because we're doing that, we're using far more off-the-shelf equipment. And then we're moving a lot of our processing and a lot of our software onto off-the-shelf blades into data centers. So I don't think Viasat's any different to anybody else. We do it slightly differently, but everyone's doing the same thing. So if you look at our biggest hardware vendors right now, they're people like Cisco and Juniper and Hewlett Packard and the big data center providers, because that's the way the networks have migrated. That's the way. Gone are the days of telephone exchanges with hundreds of racks of equipment. Now we're into this hyper data center with hundreds of racks of gear. And like Harsh said before, you know, and so if you're moving all your compute into very large commercial data centers, then you're very connected to all the other cloud services that your customers need access to. So it's because you're co-located, or all these data centers have great connectivity amongst themselves. So, you know, the way we look at it is still not software-defined satellites. We look at our end-to-end strategy. We put a lot more emphasis, I think, on the ground. We've got a lot of development going into our Viasat-3 ground infrastructure on how we process, how we do things, rather than, you know, because we want to get as much capacity as we can within the satellite. So we make value judgments about where we put functionality between the ground and the satellite, and we're very tightly integrated between the two because we design both. But when we're talking about, you know, cloud and AI, I do want to say we're massive users of cloud services, not just a provider of them. I mean, satellite in of itself is still really, if you take a step back, it still really is an access technology. So we're talking about how do we optimize the access from the customer, whether that be an aircraft or a ship or a user or an enterprise or a residential customer. How do you optimize that access from the client through the network into the services that they want to use? And predominantly, as we move forward, those services are cloud-based. So you want to be, if you're putting your network in the cloud, which we all are, we're doing one degree or another, then you're inherently getting that connection closer, and you're running down and reducing latency. From an AI point of view, I think it's interesting to point out that, like I said, we like, I think all of my colleagues here, we're big users of AI rather than giving people access to it. So if your objective is to have flexible bandwidth, flexible capacity, and the ability to move capacity where you want it, obviously then your ultimate goal is to try and do that as real time as possible. And the number of calculations you need to do on large satellites to move that stuff around is past human, if that makes sense. So we're very much investing a lot of money, not just on our existing, on our new Viasat-3 satellites, but going back in time and managing the fleet on how we allocate capacity between our bent pipe satellites, our new flexible satellites, all of that sort of stuff. And we're using, you know, developing AI to manage this, because it is a very, you know, I'm sure, I don't think anyone's disagreeing with me, it is a very manual, time-intensive process to move capacity around between birds or within the same bird, you know, to balance your customer needs, you know, because like I said, it's very difficult to predict usage 18 years in advance when you had the old bent pipe satellites. So we're very much investing in AI. AI, of course, will be sitting in data center style services on generic blades. So when we were looking at the question, Jose, it's both from a customer use point of view, but also our own internal use. And I think we're all heading down this same path. Flexible capacity as much as we can, because we can't predict it anymore. Who can predict what's going to happen 15 years from now, right? So we want flexibility. We want the ability to manage. We want the ability to move stuff around in real time. And that is almost the quintessential definition of what you use AI for.
Great. All right. Thank you. Harsh, do you agree with what's been said so far?
Yeah.
Flexibility and standards, I think, is one that's different from, at least from Terry and Peter. What's your viewpoint on that?
No, absolutely. I mean, we agree with both of their statements. So, I mean, if I speak about SES, I mean, we also have this drive for flexibility. Not necessarily every satellite needs to be software defined. I can give you an example from our two recent, two satellite announcement in Europe, Astra 1P and Astra 1Q. Astra 1P is a traditional wide beam geosatellite, really catering to the DTH strong video market that we have in Europe. It is not software defined. While Astra 1Q is another which has a wide beam as well as a flexible HTS payload on it, where we can move the HTS payload based on the requirements of the customers. So this is there's some flexibility on the satellite, and it is in a way software defined. So it based on the application, the satellite design and decisions are taken. The flexible payloads are coming. They are happening as we speak. The industry is pushing towards, I would say, more flexible, smarter, and a very shorter lead time for building these programs. Let's talk. NSR estimates there will be 17,000 satellites which will be launched in the next 10 years, right?
You're counting.
Yeah, most of it will be NGSOs, right? But 95% or more will have some sort of software-defined functionality or flexibility on board on the satellite. And then this is very much to what Peter said, right? There is uncertainty. You don't know in what happens in which market. You need to have that flexibility. And NGSOs, the way they operate, the inherent constellation architecture mandates having some software-defined functionality available on the satellites. Now going back to your question on open standards, we see it no different, as Terry said. Firstly, on the telco market, all our solutions are MEF certified, Metro Ethernet Forum, which means we can easily integrate into telcos and carriers networks. Then on the 5G side, we are again, like Intelsat, part of these 5GPP and SATIS 5G forums, building standards, helping the industry to adopt satellite in a meaningful way. Satellite was a last resort technology. It's changing. We've seen that with mobile operators investing into constellations and partnerships being formed. And I would see that mobile network industry will continue to recognize satellite as a much more meaningful play rather than just a means of last resort or maybe a tick in the box. So we'll continue to do that. Our mPOWER satellites we are building it on ONAP, the open source architecture, including mainly important for the automation of service delivery, for some in-house work, as well as the orchestration. SES 17, which has just been launched for the Americas, it is a software-defined satellite. We are investing in the adaptive resource control or dynamic software control on the ground, which SES will control in the first phase. But then with right amount of training and experience to the sophisticated customers, we'll pass on this software capability to the customers to tear down and increase capacity as they go along.
Great. All right. So far, it seems like, to me at least, that you're the incumbents and you're in agreement in terms of risk-taking, a little bit of difference in standards, going after backhaul, being software-defined flexibility. And I agree, it's the right way to go, and our research shows that too. But now we've got these new entrants coming in, and they've come in already. So SpaceX with Starlink launched thousands of satellites. They're announcing that they have 90,000 beta testers, which will easily, as they claim, convert to commercial users. They're getting subsidies from the US FCC to RDOF. And then you've got Amazon Kuiper, very big company. They've got AWS, they can leverage that. You've got Eutelsat and OneWeb. So how do you address their entrance? You've touched about this a little bit. We see them as a threat, but some of you, if not all of you, see them as an opportunity. So let's take a look at the threats first, and then let us know what the opportunity lies when these networks come in. Terry, your viewpoint, please.
Yeah, so I've got lots of thoughts around this, so bear with me as I trail through the thoughts. Look, I think positive things around LEOs is it's raised the satellite flag. Our customers and governments are a lot more aware of satellite once more because of the people behind these constellations and the way they're going to market, which is a positive, because having people want to talk about satellite is positive. It's brought more investment into our industry, which again is a very positive thing. And it helps us innovate more when there's more money and the requirements of these constellations are challenging. We get interesting stuff happening with things like antenna design. So really positive things going on. I think there's certain areas where we think LEO constellations make sense. We believe in the government sector. We believe in mobility sector. Make a lot of sense. You know, a lot of the time these constellations are over water. 70% of the Earth is water, and these things don't differentiate between water and land. But something that Peter said, you know, these hybrid networks are what we need to look at. And we've been a proponent of this for a long, long time, saying that if you could sort of at the application level decide whether it should go over the GEO or the LEO or the MEO constellation, that's the ideal. You choose at that point, throw it over whatever network that makes sense. The customer doesn't even need to know, and then deliver the service. And on the 3rd of November, we worked with OneWeb in a demonstration to the Department of Defence. So OneWeb and Intelsat basically showed the ability to switch data flow between orbits using software to determine which connection would provide the best experience, and it was instantaneous. And it was a very successful demonstration we did with the DoD. So that's, you know, a LEO and a GEO having instantaneous switching between the two based on application level, something we've talked about that we finally demonstrated, very, very powerful demonstration. Will LEO connect the 3.7 billion people that aren't connected? I don't think so. So I don't think that's where LEO goes. And do the economics of the constellation make sense over time? You know, if you look at the fundamentals, we have an interesting perspective. Our CFO came from OneWeb. Our CCO came from OneWeb. Our VP of Innovations came from OneWeb. So we have, you know, insight into how that organisation developed its network and its cost structure. And, you know, they went through Chapter 11 protection and had new investors come out and provide a new lease of life. So, you know, that's one way to get rid of some of the investment that was put into it. The others, like Starlink and Cooper, have very deep pockets with owners who can, you know, play around with a little bit of technology, and it doesn't hurt them too much. But does it make sense over time is the question. When will a shareholder say, I want profit and not promise? You know, and you know, in one of these seminars that were done by APSCC, Adi also spoke about LEO's entrance into Indonesia. I watched that and sort of paraphrasing it. Indonesia is an interesting place. It's ideal for satellite because of the nature of the islands and the spread of the country. And if you look at what is being done by government and by private enterprise, they've seen how satellite can solve many problems. There's 3 high throughput satellites that will be coming into play in 2023 in Indonesia. You've got the Bakti project, which Harsh has spoken about. Both Intelsat and SES have a play in that. But when their own satellite arrives, it's a 160 gigabit satellite that's due in 2023. You've got Telkomsat with their own high throughput satellite at 113. And you've got PSN with their own satellite. If you add all of the capacities together, just through those indigenous plays, you've got 360 gigabits coming into Indonesia in 2023. We're unsure what the LEO constellations bring to Indonesia because a lot of Indonesia is water. And they talk about capacities of 100 gigabits to 150 gigabits. Well, a lot of that's going to be over water where maybe there aren't going to be a lot of people. There might be some fishermen. And a lot of it's going to places like Java, which are really well connected, where they need Papua connectivity. Because of the way a LEO constellation works, it sort of spreads capacity evenly, whereas with high throughput and with software defined, we can divert the capacity to where it's really needed. So that flexibility that we have sort of is advantageous when we look at designing networks and providing capacity where it's really needed. I think the other challenge that LEOs have is market entry. So Indonesia, the one I've spoken about, is probably the largest market by volume of people that these LEO constellations have access to, which is not too limited. But if you look at China and India, that's going to be really challenging. If you look at Sunil Bharti spoke at the recent AVIA satellite conference, and he spoke about the challenge of market entry for OneWeb. And he spoke of 30 countries where market entry was going to be a challenge. We've seen that challenge in India. Our landing rights for our high throughput satellite over India took 4 years. If it takes a LEO 4 years to get access into India, those satellites have a 5-year shelf life. So how does the business case close for those? So lots of questions on market access, longevity, how deep are the pockets? Does it make sense? Is the technology good? It's great. Do we want to use it? Of course we do. But does the business case close? And I think the last thing I really want to say is something that actually Mark Dankberg often speaks about, and it's the idea around basically orbital debris. And I think we need to speak about that a lot more as a organisation. If you look at Donald Kessler was a guy who was a scientist in 1978 in NASA, and he spoke about the Kessler syndrome, which basically says the more satellites we put up there, the more chance there is of collision. And then you get to a point where the Kessler syndrome kicks in and you have an orbit of debris surrounding us, and we can't use space anymore. Access to space is no longer there. And I think we've got a real problem with the regulatory bodies, whether it's the FCC or whether it's the ITU, aren't challenging the constellations enough about the future of avoiding collision and issues with debris and deorbiting. And there's a company, I'm just trying to think of the name of it, called MITRE, I think it was, that did a survey for the National Science Foundation of the US. And they looked at 600-kilometre LEO orbit and what's the theoretical number of satellites you could have. And that's dependent, of course, on the cross-sectional area, the size, etc. But they came up with a figure of about 40,000 satellites. And if you went beyond that, it was unsustainable. You would have collisions, you'd create debris, and it would be a disaster for our sector. So I think we need to challenge people like the FCC and the ITU around those things. If you look at Starlink, they have 12,000 satellites that have been approved. They've got 30,000 constellation that they want approval for. That takes us already to over 40,000. You've got Cooper with thousands of satellites. You've got the Chinese talking about a 30,000 satellite constellation. You've got Rwanda under the influence of Greg Wilder again talking about 300,000 satellites. But I think we need to realise there's a finite number you can have up there. There's more study that needs to be done around that. And we need to be accountable. And it shouldn't just be for US or Chinese organisations. If you look at GEO, it was for the whole world. And in the 70s, the ITU sort of managed that. And if you look at the GEOs that are up there today, 25% of them are through the FCC. The rest are through other nations in the world. And if all nations need to have access to LEO, then we need to think about how do we provide orbital LEO constellations that can go global, that have global representation and not just one or two countries. So I think there's a lot of debate around that. And if we don't talk about it publicly, and if we don't raise profile, and if we don't look to educate the regulators and demand sort of answers, then we could be in 10, 15 years in a really tough situation.
Great, thank you. So they won't close the business case. They're dangerous for the entire satellite industry because of debris. and the regulators have to be.
I'm saying it's a challenging business case. So the constellation is smaller if it's looking at certain segments, maybe, but there's a need and there's a balance. I think that's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. So I think we've been saying, and I've been saying at conferences for the last 3 years, we don't understand how the business case closes of these networks in of themselves, independently. And I agree with Terry's comments, and I was at the Southern Space Symposium the last 2 days. The commentary coming out of there is exactly the same. We don't understand how the business case closes, especially in the residential sense. So if you look at most of these LEO operators are promising to close the digital divide in all of these outback rural areas, but it's going to be difficult at residential ARPUs. And like Terry said, one of them's gone through Chapter 11 to shed some debt. If you look at most of them today, they're very much, I don't want to say reliant, they're very much searching for government funding. So if you look at Starlink's, through RDOF funding, OneWeb through the UK government, Telesat through the equivalent of Canadian RDOF funding. So these guys are potentially going to only be going to residential if they've got government subsidies. So then what you hear at the language at the conferences is that most of these guys start to move away from language around, I'm going to connect hundreds of millions of residential customers, moving up into commercial air, enterprise and government, right? And so then, it's a very different, you get a very different story over the course of time when you talk to these guys. So I think the business case, I'm with Terry, business case is challenging. I don't know how they're going to do it. You're putting up 30,000 satellites and you've got to replace them every 5 years, which means over the 15-year life of a GEO, you've got to put up 90,000 satellites. And then you're over water 70% of the time. I'd add Russia to the mix with respect to landing rights. You've got India, China, Russia, of the 30% of land mass you've got left. And then I think the other thing not to discount is that you do need ground infrastructure for these satellites, and you've got to put it somewhere. And you've got to, if you're flying all around the world, you've got to have ground infrastructure in a lot of places, or you've got to have inter-satellite links. And if you don't have, and the ISLs take up real estate and weight and mass on the satellites, and they take up power, and away you go, right? So it's just interesting to crunch the numbers and try and come up with a business case. And I think there is a reliance on the fact that people value latency. Certainly through our residential customers, we have 600,000 of them in the US. Latency isn't in their top three of things they want. What they want is they want speed, they want bandwidth, and they want low cost. And if you look at their usage patterns, and I'm pretty sure these guys would have the same thing, 70% of the traffic on our network in our residential customers is video downloads, which is not latency sensitive. You click and then it downloads. So our own internal research sort of says, yes, latency is important, but not to every customer. So this is why the importance, like Terry said before, it's the importance of hybrid networks. You have a LEO constellation that maybe doesn't have the capacity, but is there for your latency applications, but your high throughput downloads, you go through your big high throughput GEOs satellites, right? And it's that mix that gives you something. But if you're relying on only LEO, you're potentially going to struggle. It's interesting, there's a bit of a Twitter war in the last 24 hours on whether one of these constellations has as deep pockets as we think, and so there's a consultant having a go at one of them, and there's an internal memo being leaked. So I think do your own research and have a look at it. But I think some of the pockets aren't as deep as we think, right? And certainly you can't launch all of that stuff and not earn a commercial return, like Terry said. So the way that's more sort of us saying we don't understand it, but the way we're combating it from a Viasat point of view is sticking to our strategy. Our strategy is this hybrid approach. We believe driving the cost of bandwidth down is moving satellite out of niche into more mainstream, and we think that's what we have to do. So the way you close the digital divide is you make your cost per bit cheap, as cheap as you can. And if you've got specialist applications, you use specialist kinds of things for that, but you might get a premium for that. But if you want to move into residential and you want to close the digital divide, you want to connect these however many billion unconnected people, you've got to have a low cost bit. And you can't be you can't be subsidizing hundreds of thousands of terminals, of these quite expensive flat panel antennas for a residential service in the middle of Asia or the middle of Africa. So our view on combating them is, we're continuing to execute on the strategy we've always had, which is our ViaSat-3 strategy, high throughput satellites, focused over the land, like Terry said, some broader coverage for our commercial air business and some broader coverage for our maritime business, but the bulk of the capacity flexibly able to be allocated, like Harsh was saying, but being able to flexibly allocate it predominantly over the land where the people are, because that's where the revenue is, with some wider, thinner coverage over the oceans for maritime and commercial air and some of the government purposes. So continuing to execute on that strategy through Viasat-3, and we've announced further generations of those satellites as well. So that's how we're combating it. We've got a watching brief on it. We don't quite understand it, like Terry said. There's some questions to be asked, and then we're sticking to our knitting.
Great. Just to follow up to that for everyone. So it seems like business case doesn't close. Lots of challenges to be addressed, but they're entering the marketplace and they're disrupting it. So whether this huge supply comes in, price will continue to go down. Would that impact the value proposition that you have? Would your prices need to go down if or when they do come up with an inexpensive $300 terminal? Would you have to match that as well? I'll give it to Harsh first, and then Terry and Peter can chime in. Harsh.
Look, Jose, firstly, I agree with what all Terry and Peter said, right? The business case is yet to be proven. SES is not necessarily averse to LEOs, right? We've evaluated it in much greater depth before investing in NEO satellites. Just a comparison, right? With 6 satellites on the O3b mPOWER, we can do a global service. And when you come to the LEO side, you need hundreds or thousands of satellites. And it's a cash intensive cycle, which keeps repeating every 5 years. So, Terry's point, 4 years, if it takes for them to get landing rights into key countries like India or China, 5 years is the shelf life. They will burn cash much faster than they will earn. And you will see that happening. We saw that happening in the first few years. Also, the massive infrastructure, right? Needed gateways. These are like football fields of antenna farms. Just to have handovers between these hundreds of satellites. It's not easy. It's not going to be easy. But one thing I will say is, yes, they've created that mind share. They've created that excitement in the industry that was needed, right? Governments and mobile operators, telcos are sitting up and taking notice that satellite is here to stay, and it could become mainstream. Now coming back to, we don't ignore them at all. We see them as, some places we will see them as competition. Some places we see them as complementing with us. Look, give or take, the satellite industry is going to expand. The capacity is going to expand in Asia from 1 terabit to 30 terabits in 10 years, right? It's a 30x expansion. There will be addressable market size will increase. Everyone will have a role to play. The geo wide beam satellites, very good for DTH, will continue to monetize that. The geo wide beam for data, I would see that will be under pressure. Maybe for mobility, it makes sense, like Peter, for the wide coverage. But beyond that, for mobile backhauling, I would say the wide beam satellites will struggle. HTS will be the way to go, or the very high throughput geo satellites will be the way to go. And medium Earth orbit satellites will sit somewhere in between, where you need a little higher throughput. The customers are latency sensitive 5G applications, and their MEO will have a role to play. I think the terminal side, terminal cost, very important. So LEOs are advertising very cost-effective terminals. to be seen whether that's the real cost or it's part of a marketing package. So SES is, we recognize that customers are sensitive to CapEx investment. We continue to hold our narrative and our discussions around TCO, total cost of ownership of a particular solution. And that's where you clearly carve out and explain to the customer what does CapEx do and what is really the OpEx. And if you can win that battle with the customer in terms of TCO, I think that's where we see that.
Bottom line, Harsh, are they going to make it here in Asia, given all the considerations, not closing the business case, challenges? They're going to make it here?
They will. In what way or form, I don't know. That's I don't have a crystal ball to see through that. But yeah, they will get into. They've invested so much amount of money that it's very important for them to break into. And all this conversation around consumer broadband, when millions of people connected, to secure government funding or really getting government interested for digital inclusion projects is changing, right? We've seen the narrative change completely. OneWeb has pretty much said they've now stopped talking about consumer broadband and pretty much focusing on the same segments we all focus. And Telesat has been day one saying that they don't do consumer, but Starlink is really direct to the consumers. It's yet to be seen, and what impact and what volume they will have an impact. But look, the investments have started to flow, gateways are starting to be built out. I'm sure they will be there.
Okay, Terry, do you agree?
Look, I got a few comments. I think some of the LEOs have more aggressive market entry tactics, and they are not necessarily working and may cause more hindrance. If you look at Starlink in India, who have been selling a beta play into that market and have pre-orders, the Department of Telecommunication have just said in the last few days that they have to stop offering these beta services and must get a license first. They need to play to the same rules that everyone else is playing. Because your owner may have sort of world domination and is a recognized name, it doesn't give you the ability to enter a market. So I think that they could have negative effects on entry into market. Antenna prices is subsidized by the entities. We know they took large orders and we know they subsidize and they're looking to get they're selling a market at $500 US. We know the cost is closer to $2,000. They want to get the cost closer to $1,000 over time. That's still a lot of money when you're looking at a broadband consumer play. And it doesn't, that for a broadband consumer play doesn't translate into a developing country in Asia Pacific just due to sheer cost. So we're not seeing them in the sense of their pricing is challenging us, but their conversation and their play around the talk of latency changes the conversation we have with our customer. And I'm in violent agreement with Peter that latency isn't an issue in probably 90% of the applications of our customers. It's not the issue. And they're using that as we're going to be fast and all of that. Well, that's great for if you're gaming or if you're doing financial trading, you've got some obscure software that just can't work with your TCP/IP acceleration or whatever, or your shaping. But it's the minority, it's not the majority. I think we have more challenges from other geos being very aggressive with pricing in region than we have from the LEOs play. I think, again, I think they see that maybe isn't their play and they need to move more into the M&O and into the maritime mobility world. But if you can only order via a credit card and there's no backup, it can be challenging. I've seen the New South Wales Police give feedback on their trials with one of the LEO operators and said it was very much an amateur experience, not something that he would say you would sell to an enterprise. So, lots of, look, I'm not saying that they won't get there, but there are a hell of a lot of challenges, and their models will need to change. They'll need to adapt. I think if you think of O3B before SES moved in, people thought they were going the same direction. So, maybe it's a partnership with another player, maybe it's a different form of their business case go to market going forward. But we don't see them too much influencing our price or challenging us much in the markets we deal in presently.
Great. All right. Thank you, Terry. Peter, are they going to make it here in Asia?
No, I couldn't agree with the other guys more. I think we call it, Harsh calls it TCO, which includes everything. We focus in our residential business on what we call SAC, and that's your subscriber acquisition cost. And so, it's going to be very hard if you're absorbing $1,500 US of SAC. You have to sell a lot of $50 months or $40 months or $30 months to get your $1,500 back. So I think, Rez, you compare that to a Geo where you've got a modem and a bit of pressed tin as a dish. Your SAC costs are much, much lower. In the hundreds rather than the thousands. So I think they're going to struggle from the perspective of, your SAC versus your revenue. So if you're chasing it, that's why you chase enterprise customers, right? Because your ARPU's higher and you get your SAC paid back quicker. But if you're going to chase residential, I think it's going to be difficult if you're subsidising, like Terry said. Our numbers are our analysis, because we make flat panel antennas, so our analysis is the same. If you're chasing $1,000 worth of SAC or $1,500 worth of SAC off the hardware alone, and then you've got the installation costs, and if you're deploying it to Outback Indonesia or Outback Australia, it doesn't matter. Your deployment costs are high. You've got a lot of SAC to make up. And if you're not charging much for the residential service, you might have 2 years worth of SAC or more, and before you make any money on the service. So I think it's going to be interesting, and this is what we keep saying about the business case, Jose. It's going to be interesting to look at the business case, particularly in residential, where the ARPUs are lower and you've got a pretty high SAC. And I think that's where a lot of the efforts that the geo operators have gone into, not just ourselves, but everybody, is to, when you've got pressed tin dish and you're getting your custom modems right down, and you're consolidating more and more hardware into single chips and things like that. I think, we keep doing that, we're going to be able to hold them at bay. Like Terry said, I don't see them putting a huge amount of price pressure on us. At the moment, they're charging $500 here in Aussie as well, for a terminal. Everyone's service looks great when you've got 3 people on the satellite, and it's the similar story to 5G down here. I was saying to someone at the conference yesterday, of course you can get 2.5 gig download on a base station when you've got 1 person on it. So the question becomes, when you start to load these services up, whether it be 5G, whether it be LEO, whether it be anything, you start to load these services up, and then you'll start to see what the real performance looks like, and you add that to your SAC costs, and you add that to all your total cost of ownership. If you want to include, if you include the satellite constellation itself and the ground infrastructure in a TCO calculation, like Harsh says, that's where we look at it and say, well, how's the business case goes? If you go on a subscriber basis and you just do SAC and and ARPUs, and it's going to be very, very interesting. And I'm no genius in this sort of stuff, but I struggle with how the numbers get put together.
Okay, excellent. So we're on top of the hour. I just want to make one final question, and then we move to closing statements. So it seems like, if I'm hearing you all correctly, with the non-geos coming in, it's really back to basics, right? Your ARPU, your TCO, your SAC, close the business case, and I completely agree. But many are saying that we're in this new era, so to speak. And in order to move forward and tap into the opportunities, as well as deal with the challenges, you have to vertically integrate. And arguably, Viasat has done that. But people are saying, well, you have to do maybe a SpaceX where you have build your satellite, launch your satellite, and maybe move even down the value chain. Some are even saying you have to integrate EO. If you look at the agricultural sector, you've got database and SATCOM, but more and more you have to look at big data analytics, and it requires EO. So lots of recommendations, lots of dynamics, lots of technologies in the mix. So one question, do you need to go vertically integrated in this so-called new era? Terry.
That's a path that Viasat and Inmarsat have chosen and works well for them. I think when we look at our commercial aviation acquisition, the 2 KU antenna that we got access to, and that sort of is the first sort of play we've done around sort of having any sort of play with antenna, and sort of touches on vertical integration. But we believe that scale will come through open standards. I know Steve Collar talks about scale through different satellite operators working together, sharing sort of capacities and paying for capacity. When you're on one network and when you're roaming to the other, you pay for capacity on that network, and he's promoting that play, which is an interesting play because he believes none of us on our own can get scale, and this is one way we can achieve scale, which is important for bringing costs down and being part of the wider community rather than just at the edge. And that's where our play is. I think our play is, as I said at the start, with open standards. We're going towards 3G, 3GPP, 5G, and virtualization of the network. So Peter was talking about how they're using compute shelf power equipment in their data centers on the ground. That's how we see it moving forward. We're working with technologists around that, computing at the edge, and reducing costs, reducing reliance on proprietary plays. If you look at, if you choose a Hughes system or if you choose a GLAT system, they have so much access to silicon, and they don't create the volume you need to get the price points you need. If you go virtualized network, get rid of the satellite modems, go sort of open standards, unified modem, then price points come down because you can buy this off the shelf equipment. So our vision going forward is towards this open standard play rather than a vertically integrated play. I can see benefits around controlling the whole architecture and making more efficiency. So it's, I think both are interesting approaches, but ours is definitely moving more towards an open standard.
Great, thank you. Harsh, review?
Yeah, so vertical integration, for certain industry verticals, it makes sense. So like mobility, it does make sense. SES also keenly looks at partners where we can do this. So that's always on the radar. But having said that, vertical integration is not necessarily going to scale the business, right? Every organization has their specialization, and it's unrealistic to think that one organization can do it all and do it in the cost-effective and the most efficient manner. So as Terry said, right, we believe partnerships are key, right? Build the trust with the partnerships. In these partnerships, bring these partners closer to our business. So the technology, for example, technology equipment vendors are very much part of our now TCO discussions, right? When we start into this large engagements with mobile operators, they're very much part and parcel of this discussion. What can be done in how to reduce the TCO, how to match what they're earning on the cell side, for example. So that's something we do on a daily basis, and we'll continue to do that in much bigger scale when we go to Empower. And what Terry said about virtualization and automation, of course, is very, very important to achieve that scale. So not necessarily vertical integration is the only key to success.
Great, thank you. So finally, Peter, short viewpoint on vertical integration and your closing statement, please, on mergers and acquisitions, partnerships, the changing competitive landscape in the Asia Pacific.
So on vertical integration, I think we see it as something that we want to do where it gives us a strategic advantage, and it's in our wheelhouse. So, for example, the reason we vertically integrate, design and build our own payloads on the satellites and integrate tightly with the ground is because our strategy is to put as lower cost bits in orbit as possible. So we can't get that in the commercial marketplace, so we do that ourselves. That being said, we don't vertically integrate everything. We buy the satellite buses from Boeing. We buy commercial hardware in our data centers. We buy commercial fiber. We buy commercial hardware from Juniper, from HP, from Dell, from all these guys. So we only vertically integrate where it's giving us, where we can't get what we want in the marketplace, and therefore we see a strategic advantage in doing it ourselves. We will never go and be a launch provider, for example, and SpaceX is they're using that as their strategic advantage to get a lot of LEOs into space cheaper, and Amazon's doing the same thing. Kuiper's doing the same thing. So they're using that side to it, but we won't do that. We won't build our own satellite buses. We won't launch them ourselves. We're only going to integrate the pieces that make sense, and that's the tight integration between the ground terminal, the payload, and the ground infrastructure, if that makes sense. So, and what was the second part of the question?
Your closing statement, please, on mergers and acquisitions, partnerships, and the competitive landscape here in the Asia Pacific.
Yeah, so the competitive landscape here, I think, as you pointed out recently, especially with Indonesia, we're competing against a number of different things. We're competing against sovereign satellite capabilities in the governments, and I think Harsh or Terry was mentioning Indonesia. I think that's a great example. Here in Australia, similar thing with NBN. In reality, it's a government subsidised and funded satellite business. So we're competing against that. But I still hark back to my opening comments that our biggest competition here is still the regulatory framework around 5G and the 5G operators. So we as a satellite industry need to, and we have done, we did a lot of it leading up to WRC 19 with the regulators in Southeast Asia, working together to protect our interests. We're frenemies, right? We compete in some respects, but we also have the same interests in protecting spectrum, protecting landing rights, protecting regulatory environments. So we're very much on the page that our competition or our risk here in Asia is not necessarily the people on this conference or even the LEO operators. It's more the 5G forum, the protection of spectrum, the ensuring that spectrum is low cost, that we don't get into auctions, which some countries are proposing, that we get free and open landing rights. And also, I think Terry put it very well, but the ITU is stuck in a geo mode from 20 years ago, and we've got to get them out of that and start to understand what all these LEOs mean, particularly from a debris point of view. So if you look at risk, that's another risk, is that our businesses could disappear if we're not careful. With these guys, at a number of conferences I've heard it say, it's the Wild West at the moment. That's a quote from yesterday or the day before, but the LEOs, it's pretty much the Wild West, and the GOs are regulated. We work together under ITU rules, but there are no rules in LEO.
Great, thank you. Harsh, your closing statement, please.
Yeah, look, it's a super exciting time for the industry. There's innovation all around. Yes, there are a lot of questions being asked, but as I say, right, the telcos, the large carriers, mobile operators, governments are all sitting up and taking notice that satellite will have a more meaningful play in the connectivity space. So I just look forward to what it brings. There will be some chaos as we go along the way. There will be some learnings for every one of us. So can't wait for the future.
Thank you. And finally, Terry, what do you think of the Wild West? Closing statement.
Yeah, Wild West, I like that. And it's very much a concern because that is one of the risks we're talking about. You know, I think it is a Wild West and people are going to, it's sort of like a gold rush. People are trying to get the gold before it's licensed. And we really need to educate, we really need to vocalize that because it's the industry that's going to suffer in 10, 15 years. It's sort of like, you know, we need to challenge it now before it's too late. So I think that's a real important message to get out there. I think on top of that, Asia proves to be very exciting. The industry is very exciting. There's lots of operators and hence there's lots of opportunities. Some of those are in different variations of stress, which creates opportunities for us. But I think, you know, I think multi-orbit, multi-spectrum, virtualization, all really exciting things for us going forward and introducing into Asia Pacific. I think alliances are a word we're going to hear more of. I think that makes sense when it comes to scale, but it's a great time for the industry, but we need to protect it. So we need to be vocal and we need to educate.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry, Harsh, and Peter, for your excellent insights. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for participating in the webinar. Look for APSCC series of webinars in the future. Thank you, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you for that, Jose. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Harsh. Thank you, Peter. Again, a very interesting look at the Wild West that is emerging in the satellite industry. Anyway, a pleasure to have all of your perspectives and viewpoints. And again, thank you very much to Intelsat for your generous support of the session. Please do continue watching the series. There's a lot going on, and as we come to the end of the year, we'll be looking forward to a look ahead at 2022 and a look back at the highlights of 2021 as we bring the year to an end. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you soon here in the APSCC webinar series.